All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is a special presentation. I'd like to thank Brad Hogg for convincing Ian Steppler to take some time out of his busy schedule to give us a talk on sustainability in the apiary after the spring and the kind of horrific initial start to the season and some pretty significant winter losses. It's really nice to touch base and kind of get Ian's perspective and outlook and predictions, as much as that's humanly possible, to see where he's going to be going in the next 60 and 90 days or so. So without further ado, I present Ian Steppler with his talk on sustainability in the apiary. Over to you, Ian.
Okay, thanks for that, John. I'll just share my screen here. Okay, good. Thanks, John, for inviting me to speak to you guys today. Brad had asked if I could speak to you a little bit about sustainability and just practices that we can use as beekeepers to employ to help manage these risks that we're experiencing as beekeepers, especially during times of hardship, kind of what we've experienced this last spring. So I started modifying my presentation to kind of reflect exactly what was going on this last spring. And I found that the presentation ended up being like 5% beekeeping and 95% bitching. So I kind of modified that back to my original presentation. And I think what I'll do is I'll just supplement some conversation throughout that relates to what's happened this last spring. Basically, the way I can sum up this last spring is just, cheers. I'll be enjoying a beverage as we talk about this. This presentation I'll be providing you is maintaining the battery within my operation. This is a sustainability presentation. It's all about managing risk of losses, having to employ methods to rejuvenate the youth within our operations, and just kind of reading our operation as we go through the year to manage our colonies effectively. So the battery within my operation I refer to as being my nukes. At all times throughout the year, I have this large number of nukes behind me at all times to be able to help me manage uncertain circumstances that happen throughout the year. And so I have these nukes built up wintering, and I release the charge of that battery from winter into spring. And then in spring going into summer is when I charge that battery back up for winter. So if we're going to look at, let's say, a typical year, or maybe not a typical year, or we look at let's say a winter loss of 20%, which would be a little bit high according to most standards, and an apiary of 10 hives, we take our battery that's behind us and simply we drop in 2 nukes from our battery to make up those winter losses instantly. So you don't have to look at those empty spots anymore. They're filled in, and you just get on with business. I find one of the hardest things to do when you experience winter loss is you look at those empty spots all the time and you just kind of dwell on them. If you take those nukes that are sitting there behind you and drop them in those spots, it kind of erases all those problems and you can just get on with life, right? Throughout the spring, we continue to take losses. We just don't take losses through the winter. We take losses all year round. So after we take our winter losses, we go into the spring and then we start really assessing our stock. And this is when we start pulling out the ones that are failing on us. And in a way, I don't take those losses. I don't take them as losses. I embrace them. I take them before they become losses, and I move them into my nuke production. So as I assess them, I just kind of slip it over, kill off that queen, drop a queen cell in there just to restart that nuke. And then for my battery, I just slip a fresh nuke into its place. And this little trick I've done is really helped me kind of revolutionize the growth and the vigor and the production within my apiary. I always had trouble in the spring, as I was saying before. you call out a unit because it's failing and it leaves an empty spot, and you just dwell in that empty spot. And before you know it, you just have a yard full of empty spots. And so then you start beekeeping, providing too much consideration to those hives that won't make you any money because they're just place takers. You're not producing, they're failing, right? And you start leaving them in there, before you know it, you have all these hives that aren't producing for you. So if we can take that unit and put it aside and not recognize it as a loss, but just recognize it as rejuvenating, you're going to use it to be able to restart and then use it the next year. Then it helps you make the decision to cut that queen, put it to the side, and then for that nuke behind you, you can just drop it in that spot. So once you get through the spring, because of that battery, and you're releasing a charge into your operation, you have as many hives as you went into winter with still. So then throughout the spring, we're also capitalizing on the growth of our colonies. And, how is that going to play out? It just depends on what type of year you're experiencing. So I happen to produce 5 nukes from this apiary of 10. Not every nuke's going to make it for you, right? So you got to be realistic. So I'm ending up with about 5 nukes in there, leaving spring, going into summer. So as we go into summer, it takes a lot of work to be able to maintain these nukes throughout the production season. So what I do is, as I'm sending my production hives in to collect the honey flow, I also do the same thing with my nukes. I set them up in a particular way to be able to capitalize on that inflow honey, and it completely takes care of all the maintenance of those nukes. I don't have to pay any attention to them, and I put them on the backside of the production yards and include them into the regular rotation of my honey pool. And it not only makes money on the nukes, like the honey coming in, but it helps pay for a lot of the costs maybe it incurs to be able to develop out these nukes. So it becomes a zero-sum game there. You build these nukes, cost you a little bit of money, maybe time and labor, some feed for winter, but that's covered because they've produced you some honey. So as fall follows through, I work my colonies pretty hard. I use a skateboard sometimes to bring queens in, or, things just happen. There's swarms or super procedures, and they maybe don't requeen themselves. So, a 20% summer loss isn't unheard of. And, I count some for a fall call. So if you account for 20% of your operation leaving summer that's failed on you, that's no worry to that, because you have these nukes that you built all summer and you're going to slip them back into that spot. So now you have as many nukes as you left winter going back into winter, just because you've been able to maintain those numbers with the nuke production. And then we slip those nukes that are sitting as, on the side, and recharge that battery and put them back into winter. So this isn't anything really new. It's just a different way of thinking about it. And just, you can just strategize your entire annual management around just maintaining the youth within the operation, focusing on production, making sure you can capitalize on every single spot within your apiary. And you do it without outsourcing any of the costs. You keep everything internal. So you cut your expenses, and pretty much, those nukes will generate you income to cover those costs. So it's the strategy that really, I've really has transformed the entire way I've managed my my operation. So how do you do this on a larger scale than 10 colonies, right? How do you implement this across the board? I put 1,600 into winter last year. I'm dabbling around the 1,200 now. So I'll just kind of give you a perspective on how I'm managing this work with all those dynamics at play. And I'll just kind of touch every once in a while on what happened to me this last spring as I relate to kind of implementing this plan. March 30th, this is what my hives look like, pretty much all, well, maybe not that good. This is an old picture, but I had a real nice looking shed of bees. I was walking the aisles, I'm seeing full boxes of bees. They're maybe a little bit warm. The shed was pretty warm, but other than that, I really had no concerns. I fed them extremely heavy because we had a very unusual fall. So I really plugged them up full of syrup because I didn't want that canola honey getting in. So I could hardly lift a box. They're so heavy. So I brought them in. March 30th, I started noticing I keep my temperature probe in my shed, and all of a sudden that nice, consistently steady temperature in the shed She dropped just like that. And I was like, what is going on? So I went in and I looked, and my hives were starving. It was this, I walk in, I see a hive like this, and it just sets a sense of panic. It's a terrible feeling. March 30th, I'm looking ahead of me, going into April, and I looked at a stretch of nice warm weather that I would get the opportunity to actually get these hives out and fly, but more importantly, to get them out to feed them. So I hurried, I got them, everything's on pallets, so I can move the hives out pretty quick. And I put some long hours in, got all the hives out, and I started emergency feeding. And this is kind of what I'm looking at. Moving my hives out, even though they had nice flight weather at that time, just snow everywhere. There's snow. And I'm filling my syrup tank, and I'm thinking to myself, what is going on here? But I got my pails out to the colonies. Pail of syrup on every colony. I was able to hold off my starvation. I was able to maintain the colonies and then identify the colonies that are really on the brink of starvation, drop a few honey frames in there. And so I was able to reinforce things. But it's a good thing at the end of March, and when I noticed that problem, that I had that opportunity to move them out in that mild spell we had just at the beginning of April. So this is a graph that I refer to at all times. I think I showed you guys this earlier, and it's created by Randy Oliver, but the data set was created by Lloyd Harris. I don't know if he's here, but I know he's a member of the Red River Apiarist Association. And it's just an amazing feat. Like, I can't say enough, but I look at this graph still all the time, and it just helps put all these dynamics of what's going on within our nest. This is a graph that's used worldwide, and we've had this developed in our backyard. It's just absolutely amazing. And you can see everything that's going on, the age of the bee throughout the year. You can see the brood line throughout the entire year, and the population of the nest throughout the year. And you just look at this and put together what you're seeing within the nest and how you're going to manage them according to their behavior, right? So I moved them out into March, which that's off just a little bit there. But this is when I moved my hives out. So my first job at that time is when I get my hives out in the spring, my focus is on feeding, stimulating that nest, getting that queen laying, getting that brood going, because it's very important to get that first round of brood to be able to switch that nest out. So I put open feed out. This is an old picture. That hives just go crazy, absolutely, or the bees over this protein source. And I'm also putting patties out. It's very important, I find, through all my little silly trials I do all the time, that the protein patties that were put on their colonies through that initial development pays back in dividends, because it just helps manage all those uncertain circumstances throughout the spring. Just provides that glut of protein as these bees are, in a sense, mining the resources within their bodies and within the rest of the nest to be able to develop out this brood. So I go into, and after I've done my supplemental feeding there, I move directly into job number 2. I'm not going to talk anything about medication. Medication typically is conducted in my second round here. I'll leave that for maybe another conversation. But job number 2, I go through and I do a very tough call, a very detailed assessment of my operation to figure out what's going on. So first off, hives are coming out of winter. Like I said earlier, we had like a 20% loss there, and we slipped those nukes in there to fill in all those dead spots. This picture here is 2018, and I took a 40% hit that spring. So as you can see, if I was running a 30% nuke operation behind me, I didn't have quite enough units to fill in those dead spots. So it kind of drains your battery right off the start. This last spring, I was able to manage my bees. I was able to hold off the starvation, but I was able to get my colonies out on the ground and flying beginning of April with like a 5% loss. But that's the first round. The first round, you see a live bee, it counted as a live hive, right? So I always count as my first round inspection. I always double up that that loss. So I seen a 5%. It ended up at about a 10% loss that come out of winter, which is pretty good. So I only needed like one, if you could equate it to like a 10 hive operation there, I only needed one colony to be able to fill in that dead spot. And I was feeling pretty good about myself at that time. And I was hearing about a lot of losses. And I was thinking, well, here's an opportunity. I can maybe help producers and sell some bees, predicting an optimistic spring ahead of me. So I go through and I make an assessment. And what I do is I tip all the colonies back and I do a detailed frame count. So I get a starting point to see where my colonies are at. So I tip them back, and the strong ones, the 8 to 10s, I mark as strong. I give them a blue tag because blue is my favorite color. And all the mediums, the 4 to 6 frames, I don't tag them because of redundancy, but then I tag the weak ones with the red tag, just so I can, focus on them a little bit more and see what is going on. Just because they're small doesn't mean they're weak. There's a lot of circumstances might make them a small colony, so I like to evaluate them to make sure I'm seeing what I'm seeing. So if we set them out right at this time, this is what I'm talking about as we're trying to stimulate that nest to flip that old winter nest out into spring. And the bees, you can see exactly what's going on here. This old nest is just kind of drifting older and older until we ignite that nest into brood production when we set them out. And then when they do that, they're mining all the resources, excuse me, within their bodies, and they're rearing this brood nest. And it's almost like they start a stopwatch. It's like click, and no longer a winter bee longevity. We are now summer bees. And it gives them like 3 to 4 weeks to be able to rear that brood nest and see through to them emerge to reestablish that nest. It's a turnover in a sense. And then they take a next step into expansion mode. And I like to describe it a little bit as I'm doing my assessments. And the reason why I'm doing my assessments is because I'm analyzing this very specific time within the spring. It's a very stressful time. It's very crucial. And there's a lot of dynamics going on at this specific point in time. And if there's going to be a failure within that queen or something else going on within that colony, you're going to see it right at this point in time. And we can recognize that. And when we recognize that, then we can then deal and manage those bees accordingly. So if we had 2 colonies going into winter, they just set themselves up masterfully. One's like a 9-frame winter colony with a really good queen, but the other one the queen started to fail throughout the spring. So I'm going through my initial assessment here. And they all both look terrific. So I mark them both with the blue tag. So about a month from that point of time, I'm going to go through and do another assessment. And what I'm looking for is maintenance and growth. And if I see maintenance and growth, then I'm going to promote that growth with more space to be able to capitalize later on. But if I don't, I can recognize that problem within that colony and act accordingly. This is a tough time to recognize a failure of the queen. If you don't catch it there, you better catch it here. So later on in May, this colony here, I'm taking a split because they're growing, right? I'm not only taking a split, but they're going to go into the honey flow and make me a lot of money. This one here is obviously failed because the brood line is flatlined and they just simply can't grow. So this colony, if we don't do anything about it, like I said earlier, if I don't provide a tough call in these units, they're just kind of not growing, and I just give a pass to that queen, they're just going to drift all the way through summer, not produce me any honey, cost me expenses, and then probably not make it through winter anyways. So what we want to do with these units is we want to identify them and requeen them, salvage that hive and throw it into the nuke operation, put it on the front side, put a queen cell in there and get her going again. So that's what I'm doing within my apiary. I'm recognizing these through my assessments, the failing units, pulling it aside, restarting it with a queen cell in my nuke operation, and then filling that spot in with a new unit there. So when I first come out of winter this year, I was seeing like a 10% loss, feeling pretty good about myself. But this spring is just failure after failure, compounding problems, just a complete disaster. We had 4 Colorado lows hit us. I had hives washed away and flooding, just stagnant growth. I had colonies that in that, when I do my assessment in a month's time, going in to reassess, I had colonies that are sitting, that had established 3 frames of brood that completely collapsed just because they couldn't maintain the work they initially established. The bees, they just disappeared, and you left with 3 frames of brood, hardly any bees in there. It's just absolutely depressing. So I had another, I forget what I put on Riel's winter loss survey, but for sure I would have put 25% spring losses on there just to dwindle. So that brought me up to about 35%, and that just eliminated my my nuke resource there. So I had a lineup of beekeepers, for sales of nukes, because there's hardly any nukes for sale this year. And then I was selling them for, I wasn't going to gouge anybody, and it just ended up, I just all of a sudden did not have any bees to sell because my hives literally disappeared in front of my eyes. So I made a bunch of awkward messages and phone calls, and there's a lot of unhappy beekeepers with me. But my rule is I look after myself first before I sell bees, and that just goes with the territory. So it is what it is. It is what it is. I literally went to a bee yard when I finally pulled the final straw. I drove to a bee yard that I was going to sell. I was preparing it to be picked up the next day. I drove into the yard, and there was a flash flood because of 6 inches, an isolated storm just southeast of Miami. 6 inches dropped, flooded the area, washed my beehive yard away. And I drove up, I had no idea. I drove up to my yard washed away. And this is one of my best yards I was going to sell. And I was just like, what the hell? It's just compounding problems after compounding problem this spring. Is just completely demoralizing. But at the end of it, I had to cut the sales, but at the end of it, I had that battery of nukes behind me, and I was able to hold the line on my colony numbers because I had this resource of hives. I could just shift into those spots. And right now we are working with pretty close to even, 1,200 production hives is what I do, and I add the nukes on top of that. So with those nukes kind of shifted in, I'm holding the line to where I'm going to be sending them into summer production. So yeah, that's about where we are right now this spring. And as we look ahead, because we're 4 weeks behind, I'm looking at the conditions, and I'm looking at the environmental happenings that's going on. And what I'm seeing happening now is what I would be seeing about 4 weeks ago. And I'm like, we're at this point of time, we should be heading into the flow, but we're actually back. We're almost into May already. So I'm trying to ratchet myself back in my management all the time and say, don't look at the calendar, just look at the environmental cues and just kind of keep things going and just kind of try to manage our bees according to what the environmental cues are telling you to do, and just stay of course, just steady as she goes, right? So this time of year when I'd be shaking bees down and getting honey boxes ready to greet that honey flow coming in, I'm putting seconds on my box right now to promote that growth going up. It seems completely awkward and backwards, but that's what we're doing. We're going through with this prolonged period of time now. We're only doing our second assessment. So we're putting our boxes up on top and just allowing the promotion of that growth to be able to try to capitalize on some of the growth we're seeing right now. So I'm not sure if that made any sense, but that's about where I am right now. Nothing's making any sense. We're just trying to manage our bees to what we're seeing that's going on, and just hoping that things add up further down the line. Hence the bottle of beer right now. So we're tipping back these colonies, and we're assessing them. We're promoting the growth. We're adding seconds onto the strong ones. Mediums we're assessing, going down to seeing why they're not growing as much. And the weak and failing ones were taken to the nursery to be requeened. So I'm going to put that in a typical year. I put that second box up on top. I call it my split box, and I set it up very specifically. What I want to do is I want to take that natural instinct of the bee to stovepipe, right, and then take that surplus brood that she just established up top and take that away as a split. So I set them up as 2 frames of foundation, and then I put a honey on each side, and then 4 empties in the center. So the idea is the bees are going to go up, clean those 4 empties. The queen's going to follow, fill those 4 up with brood, and then in perfect timing, we come around and we strip those boxes off as this perfect little split. And the bees kind of do all the work for me in that sense. I put the foundation on the outsides just to buy me time. So in a typical year, we start a little bit early, you maybe rushing the hives just a little bit, but by the time you get to the end of the split, you're usually behind because of weather, because of the workload. And those bees, maybe they've emerged with all those young bees in the dandelion flow, and they've just packed those foundation frames full of wax and honey. So it's basically just buying me insurance and buying me time is why I have those foundation frames in there. So right at this time, we are at the end of May, we're expanding the colony, right? And this is the swarm season. This is what I consider the beekeeper's job. This is what we are here to do, is to manage the growth of our hives, to be able to manipulate their growth and to capitalize on that growth with honey crops. So if we do our job properly, we can manage that growth, we can take it, make new units, and we can maintain those big colonies that'll pull in those big honey crops. So I'm taking that split right in the middle of that swarm season. So we're looking end of May, touching June, right? You can see that the queen's still the upward trajectory with her brood laying. So she's not done expanding that nest. These bees are feeling really good. The expansion is just, it's just straight up. That line's almost straight up with population growth. And, they're going to swarm. So we got to act on it. And we take advantage of all those behavioral characteristics of what they're trying to do is they're trying to propagate. And we take that and we flip that behavior into building new units. So this is when we start charging this battery. We take advantage of that spring behavior and that growth, that massive growth, and we skim the bees, skim the hives. So we can take full splits. In a typical year, I'm taking full splits. This year, we're not taking full splits. This year, we're lucky to, we're going through and identifying maybe 10% of the strong units within the apiary, which we should be leaving to produce honey, but we need to get some nukes produced this year because I got to fulfill the cycle for next year, because what if it happens again? I got to have that battery charged, ready to go again. So we're going through, we're putting a lot of time into these hives, and we're scraping the bottom of that barrel to find brood and bees just to help try to keep moving forward. And we're going to fall short with our target, but we're still getting these units built, and we're still trying to progressively move forward. So yeah, okay. So the question is, when do you start this, right? Right, I say we're going to start splitting right in the middle of June here. Well, that's very subjective. That's using a calendar. I don't like using calendars in managing bees. So what I do is I let the hives tell me when to start this work. When do you start grafting? When do you start setting these nests up to split? And it's when I see walking drones on the comb. So you look at all these estimations, and this is information I pulled from Larry Connor's, one of his presentations, and it provides you with perspective on probably when the best time is to mate queens. If you look here, you have the drone production going on in April, but there's no sexually mature drones that are actually going to mate those queens. So that's a terrible time to try to rear a lot of queens. You get into May, it gets a little bit better, but you start focusing around that end of May into June, into July. That is just high time to be able to produce splits. So that's when I focus all my work and all my time in making these splits, making up these nukes, is when I can best mate these queens. Now I'll just talk a little bit about my builder, the way I set my builders up. I do things the way I like to do things, because that's just the way I do things. But and it's maybe not typical, but it all follows the same basic principles. This year I'm not doing this just because I don't have surplus bees at my disposal to be able to stock 10 pounds of bees into a builder. Basically, all we're doing is just the bare bones basics, is scraping together like 3 frames of brood and 6 shakes of bees just to make a nuke really full of bees, and we're dropping one graft frame of 30 start. We started a frame of 45 and it was just a little bit too much, so we pulled back to about 30 start, and we're just chugging along. But these builders that I typically run, in a normal year. I run them in a way to minimize my bee resource, so I'm not, mining a whole lot of bees for my operation, and to maximize my cell production within a small period of time. So what I do is I set up these perpetual queenless builders, just full of young bees. And I find that magic number is 10 pounds of shook bees into this builder seems to be just spot on, right on the money. Not too big, not too small, just right on the money. And then I run through a bi-weekly, or maybe it's every Wednesday, we drop another frame or two of brood in just to refresh those young bees within that builder. And I run it in a 4-day graft rotation. So each builder gets a new graft frame every 4 days. And the reason why I do that is I feel that once a builder starts jelly production, and a lot, because drawing out queen cells requires a lot of work, a lot of effort. So once we energize these bees and they're focused on building out the jelly, I feel I just want to keep them going. So every 4 days, I put another graft frame in there just to keep those nurse bees feeding and feeding and feeding and feeding until I exhaust them near the end. I don't have that stop start. I don't know if there's anything behind that, but I find it just provides me just with an abundance of very consistently built cells and predictable. Some of that predictability is Carrie. I mean, she's running 100% over here, and that's absolutely amazing. But a lot of it also is the setup and the preparation of these nests, or not the nests, but the builders. So I feel that's the reason why I do that. So every frame is a 30 cell start. When they're really cooking, we'll maybe do a 45 frame or 45 cell start. And we set them up in a rotation, a 4-day rotation. So I have 4 builders going, 30 cells every day. So every day we're dropping a graft frame into these builders. And on the 4th day, we bring it back to the first builder. We shift that first frame over and we drop that new graft frame in. So, and then we continue the cycle. So every 4 days, until the 8th day, which then we take that graft frame, switch it into an incubator, which I'll talk about in just a second, and then drop another graft frame in. So it's a continual rotation of graft frames into my nukes. And if I need more than 30 cells per day, you just duplicate the process, just like everything else within the beekeeping business. When you're building your operations, you set up your systems, and when you need more, you just take that system and duplicate it, right? And you just duplicate it with more manpower, more equipment, more whatever, right? You just kind of scale yourself in that fashion. I do the same thing with my nuke operation. So here's Carrie. She's this is last year. We have 2 rows of builders going on right now, and what she's doing is she's dropping a frame into slot A. the frame that's in slot B, she's going to be transferring into the incubator, and she's going to 2 times. So we have 2 rows, right? So whatever happens in this row happens exactly in this row at the same time. So it's just a duplication of the process. So on that 8th day, I don't know if you guys are following me with all that, but if you are, on that 8th day, when we're transferring that graft frame out, we transfer them into the incubator. And this is a very vulnerable time for a cell to be handled because they're very delicate in those cells. But Carrie has a very delicate touch, and she's very swift and quick, and there's no chilling or anything. So she just transfers them into these foamies, that's what I call them, and puts it into the incubator. And one thing I find with these incubators is when I do that on day 8, it really evens out the emergence of my cells. If you look inside a builder or even a cluster, you'll notice like there's varying temperatures within that cluster depending where you are within it. And if your cells in the center of that cluster, they're going to be held more consistently and maybe warmer than maybe the ones on the outside, especially if it's a colder night. So you have the maturity of those cells within your builders vary. When you put them in a builder, especially on day 8, at a very consistent temperature, I keep it at 93.5 degrees Fahrenheit. It just evens out the emergence. So when you put them out in the nukes, they're all emerging all at the same time. Then you come back in a couple of days to check that emergence to see if there's problems. And you're not guessing whether or not they need more time or not. You just take them out and drop another one in there just to reinforce that nuke. I used to keep the nuke. beekeepers are all different in where they keep their incubators. I know some guys in California like 94 degrees because they like hot cells, quicker emergence. And then I know some guys up here that keep it at 92. And I used to keep it at 92.5, and I felt it was just a little bit too cool and a little bit too slow. So I bumped it up to 93.5, and it just seems to be right on the money. And I keep the humidity up and everything. The other thing about the incubator, which I like, is it allows you to manage the weather more effectively. So if we can't get into the builders to transfer these cells on day 8, we can push it back a day if we want and just make space to drop another graft in or whatever. It's not crucial until that cell is ready to emerge, right? So it just buys us time to be able to work with these builders when it's nice out, because it's not pleasant working or digging through builders trying to pull cells out and when it's raining. It's not good for the cell. It makes a beekeeper grumpy, and it's no fun. So with the incubator, it just helps you manage weather dynamics a little bit better. And also, if you're going out to the nuke yard, you're dropping cells and you don't have enough nukes, you just put them back in the incubator to use the next morning. So it just provides you all that flexibility. Here's Carrie. She's in her truck. She does all her grafting in the truck. She has this little tray that fits on the steering wheel. And she, crank the air conditioning in the, no, she doesn't crank the air conditioning. I keep saying that. She cranks the heat, and she drapes wet towels all over the truck to increase the humidity inside. So it's absolutely unpleasant within that. But what she's trying to do is to meet the ideal conditions within that space. So when she's grafting it, these larvae aren't drying out, because she loves every single one of those larvae. She transfers them, and it tells because her success rate's 90, nearly perfect, right? So I try to avoid her truck when she's doing this because it's very unpleasant. And this is what it looks like about 48 hours after graft, very well fed cells. I love these plastic cups because you can see how much jelly is in there. And when the builders really rock and it just fills the jelly out, sometimes they get carried away. They start filling right down into the wax, but lots of jelly, nice clean wax. I like white wax, so I try to pull all the brood comb out of my builders and put honeycomb in there. Another secret is to continually cycle sugar. If full frame of honey does you absolutely no good. Make sure that there's always an empty frame within your builder for the bees to take syrup into their stomach and then transfer it into that comb, because there's that flow of syrup continually through those bees, and that continual flow of syrup is what helps them build this wax. So you want that stimulative effect, right? So we're always looking in our builder for not just a full frame of feed, but a place for them to put that feed so they can transfer it. And it just makes makes the results a lot more consistent and appealing to look at. We use little tools. I have this because we're counting all the time. So it just helps us, not use our fingers and toes all the time. So we have this little grafting tool here and queen tracker cards. So Carrie's doing her work and she marks it down here. And at the end of the day, when I talk to her, I don't have to interrogate her to see what she's done and what hasn't been done, or if it's been done. All this information's on this card, and it's provided that line of communication between Carrie and I, so we don't actually have to talk to each other what's happened because it's on the card. And it's really helped the fluidity of our work between us. So day 10, we can start transferring. I like to transfer in day 11, which is hot because they're not as delicate and they don't chill as easy. And watch out in day 12 because they start to hatch. And this is when you start getting crawlers, right? This is one thing that these little foams help with is if you get those early emergers and they don't go and destroy all your work, they just kind of get trapped in those little foam inserts, so they can't destroy the rest of everything that's going on there. Beautiful queen sometimes, and we run out. Sometimes we got to pinch queens. We got to pinch cells because we just don't have enough work. We try to get more cells than we actually need, and then we can maybe sell some of those cells as surplus. But Carrie's always crying because pinching off cells. But a sign of a good queen rearer is a queen rearer who has too many cells and has to pinch them off. So that's the business, right? Transfer them in this carry case. Very fussy. I'm very fussy about chilled cells, so I do everything I can to be able to maintain the conditions that they need to be, because I don't want chilled cells. We put so much time and effort, and these cells are going to be making me money, so I got to make sure that they're handled appropriately. We then drop them into our nukes, into our mating yards. We scatter our nukes all across. Pastures make great mating yards. We have lots of pasture here. And you'll notice a bee yard in the distance here. Not necessarily is it important there to mate with these hives. So what they tell me is drones like to fly closer because they can fly out and up and fly more often in their congregating sites, or queens like to fly out and away and spend more time flying to find these congregating sites. So I'm not looking at this necessarily for my mating yard. I'm looking at yards around to where maybe these queens are going to be flying to. But I'm walking around this, nuke yard, and there's drones everywhere because they can smell those queens, those virgins. So I wonder sometimes how far those queens get away. And also if we have inclemental weather, if that queen's going to cut her losses, just fly straight up to one of these sites, it's not going to make a damn bit of difference anyway. Now we're going back to check the queens, and what we do is we check the success of the mating of the queen. I used to check them in 18 days because we have a lot of work going on, and right about this point of time, we have the crop blooming in these boxes. When the queen starts laying and there's lots of young bees in there, they start filling full of honey. So it doesn't give you a lot of time to be able to, transition these bees into the summer flow. You just can't sit on them forever. But I had an old beekeeper tell me one time, he says, Ian, you got to realize you're using German bees, and Germans like to take their time. So let them take their time. So now I give them 22 days before I drop the axe. I don't give them 25 days. That's too long, but 22 days is my drop axe. If you're not mated, we're either going to give you another cell, or we're going to shake you out and just get on with life. The flow is intimate. So this is like, here I am. I drop these off into one of my mating yards here along the back country road. And this is how it works. You drop off a truckload of nukes, you drop in cells, and you come back 98% success, right? And you just load them all back up, put them down, load them up. That's how it's supposed to work, right? I wish. Okay, so now we're going into the honey flow. So we're going into the last part of the presentation and how we can capitalize on these nukes to be able to cover some costs. So we're sending these nukes. We haven't developed out now. They are properly mated, and they need to be maintained. And maintaining nukes through the summer period is a lot of work. And if you're not set up properly, it requires a lot of specialized equipment that you just don't want to have at your disposal, because it's just another thing you got to buy. So I like to kind of standardize everything. And what I do is, to cover my maintenance and to standardize things, I have these units working together to be able to help me use a similar type of equipment. So I send my nukes into the honey flow. I put the nukes on the backside of the honey round. And what I do is I pair them together, or put 3 together. And these 6 frames work just masterfully. A little bit of getting some feedback there from somebody. There we go. So these 6 framers are specially developed from Murray Lewis. Yeah, I think he's the one that come up with the idea of this, because they just fit perfectly under 2 boxes of honey boxes here. So what I do is I line 3 up together, and I put 2 excluders in here, nice and tight. You got to keep those queens down, or otherwise they're a fight. And then I drop honey boxes up on top, so those nukes kind of, in a sense, merge and work together. I used to put newspaper in between the slow mergeries. I used to spray them with Honeybee Healthy just to mask the scent, but I don't bother with any of that stuff anymore. They have nectar coming in. They're feeling good. They have very little worries. I just put boxes on top, excluders and then boxes, and they merge together very well. I do the same with my 5 frames. I initially started the 5 frames. I still have them, so I still use them, but they're not as neat and tidy. They don't quite fit as uniformly underneath 2 boxes of honey. You know, my OCD kicks in a little bit, and this just looks really nice. You have straight lines, and you know, it's just everything is appealing when you look at that. This is a little more sloppy, you know, cumbersome cracks and such. But and I find when we're merging units like this together, that I've learned the hard way not to use plastic excluders. You use metal bound. The plastic kind of warps, and queens can get through, and they can fight each other. Metal bound, there's none of that, and we just make sure there's no crossing of the queens. It's interesting because when you look at units working like this, or units working in 3s like this, when those bees, if there's a problem, let's say the center colony here, you can see all the way to the top. If you have 4 boxes stacked over top of these, you can see that that center unit is queenless because they haven't done as much work. These bees, they work in a way together in a sense, but they like to keep to their own. So the work they do, they go straight up. It is really, really weird. And they go up and they kind of expand out like that. So whether they really mingle together a lot or if they really work together a lot, I don't know. I think Brad actually has some comments on that when he compared his merger units or working together units like this as compared to just single hives. And I don't think there's a lot of difference. But the point of this whole system is to incorporate this workload so it's not costing you a whole bunch of time. So we're not having to maintain these nukes because we have honey boxes over top. And as long as there's honey boxes over top, you can forget about those nukes until fall, until you have to feed them. And because the equipment's all standardized, you put it on the backside of the production yards, and it's just all the same equipment, all the same procedure. Those are just added yards, right? You're taking honey off added yards. And we run them as honey producers. We're running them, like I said, as standardized equipments. We treat that nuke yard as a production yard, and we capitalize on all that honey production. So and you know, sometimes you get things timed properly, you can make a lot of honey off these little guys. Here's a yard of 5s that I built, and I think I built them end of May into June. And these boxes are full, like absolutely plugged full of honey. So I was yielding somewhere between 65 pounds of honey net in every one of these boxes 2 times over. So you see these boxes, there's 4 stacked here. Well, I extracted 8 boxes of honey off these colonies just because I had a late flow of canola here. We had timely rains, and these colonies are just sparked right up. So they can really capitalize on that honey production. And you got to be careful because of that too, because you set them out. Here's a yard of 6s I put out, and they're a little bit small when I set them out, but I set them out on a canola field here. When I come back in 2 weeks, they were absolutely plugged full of honey just because of the work they're able to do inside there, and they just exploded. I should have had another 2 boxes on top of these guys. So you got to watch, because with all that brood going on down in here, they just erupt into growth. So make sure you stay ahead of them. Hopefully it's like that this year too. So that battery of nukes, as we go into fall, it helps us fight that continual attrition. So as I was talking before, we're looking at a 20% loss, call through the summer into the fall. And with these nukes behind me at all times, I'm able to instantly fill in those spots. So as I identify queenless units or colonies that are failing in the fall, I put 0 time into those units. I shake them into the grass. I put that equipment into storage, and then I go into my nuke yard and I drop nukes into every one of those spots. So I don't make primarily like these 6s and these 5s. I make those up, but I also make a complement of a bunch of singles up at the same time as nukes to be able to use to fill in these empty spots in the fall, just to quickly fill in those holes so I don't have to think about those losses all fall, and then try to manage things accordingly. And it also just helps continually replenish the youth within your stock. So here I am, I identify 20% summer fall time loss. Zip, I completely erase that. And as you can see here through the year, I've probably switched out 50% of my stock. by just incorporating new queens in. So you can call that, if we were going to take every one of these units as an outright loss, like in the spring we didn't, but that's a 50% loss throughout the entire yearly cycle. So we have to appreciate that as beekeepers, that we're continually losing bees. And it's the natural thing about beekeeping is losing bees, as our job as beekeepers is to replenish those losses on a continual basis. So I think about it a little bit as our cattle farm, and we're trying to target our cattle herd to its most productive age. We have young stock, we have middle stock, young stock, middle stock's about 8 or 9 years old. Then we have some old crocks in there that are about 15 or 18 years in there. We pair off the old ones. We replenish them with the young ones to be able to maintain a nice, viable, productive herd at about 6, 8, 10 years of age. That's our target, to be able to maintain the integrity within our operation. I'm doing the same thing with bees. So if you look at maybe a honeybee hive, they got the young nukes, and then you got the 1 to 2 year old, then you get the 3 to 4. 4 is getting pretty old. I don't know if there's very many old 4-year-old queens, but you're looking at those old ones, you're pairing them off, maybe they die, or maybe you can capture them and rejuvenate them into nukes before they die off, but you're continually cycling those old ones out and putting new stock in to refresh your apiary at all times. And that youth is what buys you the vigor and the production within your operation. And you have no place takers. So every spot within your apiary is going to be producing you honey. So you're not going to be stacking every single one of those hives up with boxes, because every one of those ones, if you've done your job properly, will be producing you honey. And then with the surplus that you have left over in the fall, you drop it right back into your battery and tuck them away for winter, tuck them away for next year. So then you can feel good about yourself, because you have this resource of nukes at your fingertips coming the next year. If uncertain circumstances hit again, like next year, we at least have some of these nukes to help manage that risk. We have something at our disposal to be able to cycle into our operation to be able to manage all these unpredictable occurrences. So just to finish off here, sustainability requires a shift of a management strategy. So instead of trying to focus on an annual cycle where you buy in the queens, like you're outsourcing that work, and you're trying to focus those splits on production within that same year, I've kind of focused things into a 2-year program. Everything's internal. I cut off my dependents. All the outsourcing is gone. That way I cut the costs. By shifting to a 2-year program, I'm able to develop out those queens when it's the best time to develop queens. I'm not having to do it too early because I'm meeting deadlines. I'm doing it when it's most favorable. I'm able to embrace my losses before they become losses, to put them into my nuke operation, developing out this battery, and then using that battery to capture some of these operating costs by producing honey. So with that, I apologize for the internet cutting off. I guess everybody is just, that's just the way it is with technology. But if anybody would like to have some discussion around this, or maybe comments or questions, or maybe we could talk about your year with the bees this spring, I'd be more than happy to join you in with some conversation. I'll pass it back on to you, John, or if John's not there, maybe Brad.
That was awesome, Ian. Thank you very much. I think the thing that sort of comes to mind is, especially when you're running an operation of your size, and sort of the tried and tested methods that you've got, although you're obviously open to flexibility when things have changed, but when you have something changing so vastly weather-wise this year, do you consider just sort of staying the course in the main framework of your plan, or do you start, because the whole debate is this the new spring? Is this the new summer? Are we starting to gravitate towards dry season, wet season kind of season? So in the back of your head, are you also starting to put together like auxiliary plans for this like cool, wet springs kind of being the new norm, or are you just going to or is it too soon to foster that opinion?
That's a really good question. And I've thought a little bit about that. How can I be better prepared for a situation like this? Like, I feel that I am prepared in a way because I've put a lot of effort into trying to, fortify my stock with youth and vigor, and then having this battery of stock available for me to use. But it's just not enough. It seems like this year is just not enough, and especially if we go into this next winter. If my bees are sickly with nosema, and if we have unfortunate situation again, then what happens? What am I going to do as a beekeeper to be able to manage that? And so it basically come down to the conclusion is, and maybe some advice from my old man is, don't worry about that right now and just get through this tough period, because it's hard. You don't need to be thinking about other things and other than just surviving this year alone. Get through it. And then once you get through it, then you can start strategizing and maybe find creative ways to maybe reflect on what's happened and how you can adjust to be able to make it work properly. So I'm having a heck of a time right now, just trying to maintain that cycle that I just talked about here. That cycle that seems very easy to be able to fulfill in a typical year. This year, I'm just scraping, trying to find bees to be able to do that. And I'm trying to maintain my numbers to be able to hit this honey flow, get as much honey as I can, because we're looking at $3 honey. So I want to capitalize on that too. So I don't want to start chopping yards down to be able to make these nukes to reinforce myself for next year, because I want to capitalize on the honey. But if I focus too much on the honey, then I might be sacrificing my business for next year. It's an impossible situation. I am a man that believes in options. More options at our disposal makes for better business, I always feel. So I'm looking for options. If I run into a tough time, if I can see that happening early enough, maybe I'm going to get a hold of the guy that brings packages into Manitoba and get some New Zealand packages in, just to reinforce, maybe even put some money down to make sure I have a few packages, just to be able to reinforce myself if I feel I'm going to be in a tight spot. Or options. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I become a director of the MBA, is because I feel our industry doesn't have enough options, and we don't have enough tools at our disposal to be able to handle these problems. And I won't get into this package B issue like I did last time at your meeting, after the meeting, but just looking at controlling, like nosema for one thing, in my bees. I have an extremely high level of nosema, and I'm shrugging my shoulders because the treatment that I used before didn't seem to work for me. And now I'm getting to a point of time within the year that I can't do it because of possible contamination of my honey crop. That's not acceptable. We need answers to those problems. Varroa mite, the number one problem of our industry right now. We have a treatment that supposedly looks like it's failing. We have our tech transfer program implementing a program this year to do a super focus on our hives within Manitoba to be able to see if we have resistance forming. But what's the solution if we are forming resistance? We have no solutions. We have things going on. We have oxalic acid and formic and all these alternative treatments, but we don't have that. Like, those require certain conditions, and if conditions don't add up, they don't work. And producers seen that last fall. So we need something to be able to manage these mites. Otherwise, we're all going to go out of business, right? And it's going to, we can't just rest on breeding because there's so many dynamics. And virus, I sat in at the Western Apicultural Society meeting, and they're talking about viral infections within bees. And she showed 2 lists of virus infection within our stock, and we're looking at about 5 that we really know about. And all the rest, we're not really sure what they are, how they interact with each other, or what it's all about. So we're walking in a lot of gray area. And I think that our industry needs more attention. And we look at projects, I'm kind of rambling on you here though, but I look at what Dr. Rob Curry is doing with some of the research he's doing at the University of Manitoba with oxalic acid, trying to make it more effective, and with CO2 and how maybe we can manipulate the environment of the winter shed to be able to help us with this problem. And also the tremendous amount of research going into the BCSI program, where they can diagnose your problems. You're able to, like, almost like with a cup full of bees. So there's all these exciting things happening right now, but right now there isn't a hell of a lot of things we can do, and I think we need more attention to that. So I apologize for the rambling answer to that, but I think our industry needs more attention. We need more answers. We need more options. We need more solutions to be able to keep viable. You look at some of these big guys that experience 85% loss. I was just talking to one guy this morning at 85% loss of bees. You know, and he bought a bunch of stock to get him through this year for $500 a nuke. And it just absolutely, he had to borrow money to get that. It's like, that's not acceptable. That doesn't foster for a healthy industry. We need stability. We need to maintain our operations. We need to be able to get through these tough periods of time with a solution that will bridge us through, right? So yeah, so that's a really good question, and I wish I had a really good answer for you on that, and I don't. But I think we're going to eventually get there.
Well, and again, I think you're absolutely right. You don't know if this is the new future or the anomaly, and you want to hope that it's the anomaly. And we are, you know, with the establishment of KRTP in this province and the ongoing research at the University of Manitoba, it's not like there isn't irons in the fire to address some of the things coming up, but it does seem like it's issue after issue, and if resistance is building, we need to keep fingers on the pulse of that, because you can't have too many years like this and not have significant and long-term damage to the industry. You're absolutely right. And yes, options, I think everything should be on the table and up for debate, and it will cause friction and it will cause polarization, but you know, it's getting to, you know, the situation isn't just about you know, financial benefits. It's almost about it when it starts to kind of leak into the survival mode, then you can kind of view it from different lenses. We've got a question in chat, and then Rob Young has his hand up, so I'll go to Dan's question first, and it is, do you find a 6-frame nuke winters better than a 5-frame nuke, or is it just equipment configuration preference for your supering during the flow?
Yeah, I actually do find the 6s winter a lot better actually than the 5s, and that 1 frame seems to make all the difference. Maybe it's just 1 more frame of resource or 1 more frame of brood they can rear, something about that. You'll notice that with nukes in larger equipment also. You put a nuke into, excuse me, put a nuke into a 10-frame box, and it's going to winter a lot better than it would in a 6-frame box also. So you see you see that the reason why, well, the 5s, the reason why I use 5s is just because I still have that equipment. I just keep using it, but you know, I could transfer everything over to 6s. But the reason why I manage my nukes in smaller equipment is because my intention is to, well, space for one thing. I didn't build my honey house big enough. I should have built my winter room bigger, and I just don't have that space to spare. So nukes are they take up less space. The second thing is they don't require as much cost to build them. Like instead of dumping $90 or 90 pounds into these singles to winter them through, they're weighing in at, the 6s are weighing at 60 and the 5s are weighing at 50. So we're putting less sugars into them, and same with treatments too. With the Apivar, a very effective treatment with 1 strip as compared to 2. So there's that cost savings. My focus is on trying to get them through very efficiently cost wise. And then once they get out of spray, oh, and the other thing, a very important thing too, I am a believer, this may be up for some debate from some other beekeepers, but I feel that when I'm developing out these nukes, I'm not necessarily wanting them to grow these massive, like I showed you that picture of these stacks of boxes on top of my 5s. I'm not necessarily wanting them to overachieve themselves, because I'm not wanting them to waste the queen on developing all these bees, typically to produce honey, because later on in the season there isn't a lot of nectar available. So we produce that massive hive, wear that queen out for the next year. So I like to keep her tight. And, in those configurations with the queen made later on in the year, as long as you have place for the nectar, they're not going to swarm on you. So I keep her tight. I keep her kind of in reserve. So the next year she comes out, pow, she fills up that box and she fills up my honey boxes. And then she maybe can extend a little bit further in her lifespan because we didn't wear her out on that first year of development. So that's my reasoning behind all that.
Thank you, Ian. Rob Young, you had a question. Can you unmute your mic?
Yeah, thanks, John, and thanks for the great presentation, Ian. I really appreciate it. I had a couple of questions that are related. The first is, how many breeders do you think you need to have in order to maintain appropriate genetic diversity? And my second question is, do you think you have enough bees with, I think you said you were running around 1,200. Do you think you need to bring in outside genetics occasionally to maintain the genetic diversity within your stock? Thanks very much.
Yeah, two very good questions. So, yeah, I don't know if I could. The thing is, I don't know. So I'm just going to tell you what I do. So what I do is I select from my entire apiary. I use flags and tags, and I just do an in-yard assessment to be able to identify all my top performers. And I bring 15 of those back. And it's a good question. I don't know if that's enough. You don't want to narrow things down too much. But then the question is, are we really doing that? When I'm looking at breeding from, I take those 15, then I put them through another test. I'm going through hygienic now, and I take them down, pare them down to about 5, because I feel 5 is easier to manage than trying to manage 15 breeders. So I pare it down to 5. So the question is that enough diversity as you're trying to propagate and make these bees? I think it is, because we have a lot of diversity within our stock to begin with, and there's neighbors around, and it's all drifting in, and there's a lot of interaction going on around. And I don't think by open mating like that, and I'm funneling things down too much. And I forget what you asked the second question. What is the second question you asked?
Do you feel the need to bring in outside genetics? Like, for example, do you bring in Saskatraz or other genetic lines into your operation to maintain that diversity?
Yeah, and I do that also. But I don't drop them straight into my breeding program. Sometimes I got caught one time. I got really excited about a breeding program, somebody out of province, and I brought this exciting queen in. I put it straight into my breeding program, and she was an absolute flop. Whatever is going on within his operation worked, but it didn't translate into how I manage my bees. And it just did it. The gears didn't mesh there. So I had a whole line of queens that were just kind of, not really anything too impressive. So that taught me a lesson is, if I'm going to be breeding from something, I have to make sure that I test it first. Like, I'm a man of continual assessment, so I don't know why I didn't do that to begin with. But I put these queens, I bring them in, and I put them into the yard, and I just let them perform. And if they perform to something that impresses me, then I'm going to select maybe that queen to put into my breeding program. And ever since I started doing that, I've been finding more consistency in my success rates and what I'm seeing, what I want to see within my stock. I'm seeing more of that now. So I'm bringing in Saskatraz all the time, and I'm selecting some in there because they're very gentle bee and they're very conservative, and I'm not necessarily bringing it in for the mite tolerance or anything like that, but I like the support programs that are focusing around that, because I think that maybe we need more efforts into that. And I bring in from neighbors who are excited about their queen and throw it into the yard, and just little things like that. I think it's important.
Excellent. John Spear, do you have a question? Your hand's raised.
I do, yeah. I was just listening to you, Ian, talk about the losses that you sustained after the bees came out of the shed. So it seems that your losses at that point were about 25%, and then you added on about another 10% over sort of the April-May season. Is that correct?
They come out of the shed originally at about 5%, and then I added another 5. So I calculated about 10% loss out of winter. And then the dwindle was about 20, 25% or so. Yeah.
Okay. And what's your sense in talking to other operators about their losses just coming out of winter initially before sustaining more losses through the spring? Were their losses like better than 10% just coming out of winter?
I've talked to a lot of beekeepers. April 2nd, my phone started ringing, and it's hard for me to tell because I might be stuck in an echo chamber. You know, everybody who's having problems usually are the ones that reach out and engage a lot more than the ones who aren't having problems. So it's hard to me to get a real accurate picture. And that's where we kind of leaned on Rael a little bit with his survey, because he's able to reach out to more of those beekeepers to get at that engagement, to get a clearer picture. Talking to beekeepers who are seeing like outright losses of, 70% coming out of the shed is just terrible. And talking to other producers who did very well, like 5% loss out of the shed, kind of like what I initially had there. But I think it's very consistent that most beekeepers, I think, would tell you, and from what I'm hearing, we're seeing like at least a 20% dwindle throughout the spring. So if Rael did his survey, this preliminary loss survey in Manitoba, recorded 40% loss or so at that time, pretty consistent across the board. His next survey that he, like his annual survey, he does winter loss survey, it adds 20% on top of that. Not quite 20%, but it's and maybe I shouldn't have said that either, but it's not official, but it's substantially, what am I trying to say? It is consistent across the province for that dwindle that most beekeepers experienced, because nobody could escape that spring we just encountered.
But that
Yeah,
sorry to
sure.
interrupt.
And okay, just one more comment. Just regarding the effect of Nozema, it had a huge impact. And was that impact mainly at the tail end of sort of winter, like as they were coming out and they were hit with this, the horrific spring? Would the Nozema have had the impact it did if we had a normal spring?
Yeah, I think you're right on that. I did testing with my hives going into the shed, and it showed 0 for Nozema. And obviously there wasn't 0, but I was showing very, very, very low Nozema samples. This spring has just been terribly wet and cold. It's just the perfect conditions to foster fungal gut infection. And I think Nozema just thrived on that. And I'm afraid that's probably what a lot of beekeepers are seeing with the dwindle. Mites too, like mites added another layer of stress. I noticed within my operation, I also, some of these dwindled colonies I tested and there's mites on them. So any type of stress like that just really hammered these hives back if they're sick. But Nozema is just a shrinking colony. They're very symptomatic to that. And I'm afraid that the conditions are just very favorable just for that Nozema infection to explode. They can't fly, they can't get rid of it. It's cold, the bees are confined, they're stressed. There you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
okay. Well, thanks for that.
Sorry to interrupt, John. So what I struggle with is, okay, if spring dwindling is like the chief culprit, like it may not be the beginning and end of the major losses, but it's certainly a significant contributor. So you've done your feeding properly, you've got a good fall program, you've kept your mites low, and then a horrible spring comes along, and despite your best efforts, you're sort of stuck. Now, Nozema, you can implement into your program to treat prophylactically for it, which isn't great, but again, everything's on the table. But what else can you do to combat is spring dwindling? Is there anything you can do genetically in selection? Is there can we start looking at implementing artificial heat in sheds or moving bees back and forth. Like a lot of there is no real practical solutions on the horizon to deal with weather. And I guess that's the boogeyman that's scaring under my bed, that's scaring me a lot these days.
Yeah, same with chalkbrood too. Chalkbrood's an opportunist, right? Anytime there's any type of stress on any colony, it just expresses itself because it's always there, it's always waiting. And as soon as that degree of stress comes, it just takes foothold. I wonder if Nosema acts in much the same way. Stress, when an animal is stressed, they can't defend themselves off of these pests or diseases or pathogens. And I think it just allows these diseases to be able to take foothold. And that's probably what we've seen, a very, very stressful event. I mean, you look at the spring we just went through, I don't think I've never seen a spring like that before, where we had winter to go right till May. It's just, it was cold and just terrible conditions. One thing I try to do, I think it helps maybe in a typical year, is trying to relieve that stress. And to relieve the stress is by focusing on nutrition, just trying to provide the nutrients they need to be able to develop, so they're not going into the protein stress and those dearths. It doesn't help when you have the spring, there's a continual long dearth like we had. Nobody could win in this last spring. I had my bees out beginning of April, had them start develop, and then they hit this cold spell. It was a terribly stressful event. Not even feeding could solve that. The beekeepers left their hives in the shed and avoided all of that, and they couldn't get their bees out till May. So they finally, or just before May, finally got them out, and the weather didn't improve, and they experienced massive losses. So nobody could shield themselves from this type of stress event, except for, I did do one thing, and I didn't get around to all my work when I first set them out, so I couldn't get all my patties out or medication. So I did bring some colonies back in the shed just before we had that terrible snow. Like, we had 2 feet of snow here on the farm during, when was that? Middle of April sometime. But I brought my nukes in, and I brought 1 yard of singles into the shed. And I thought I was only going to keep them in there for a week, but I ended up keeping them in there for 3 weeks. And I fed them sugar syrup, and I fed them protein patties. And I brought them back out about the same time the guys are bringing their other hives out initially. Those are my best colonies, my nukes and that single yard. I'm making splits off that single yard. So that shield from all those adverse conditions, that shield of all that stress, really benefited those bees. So that just tells you how severe the spring was in regards to how much stress it put on the colonies outside. They just could not handle it. I wish I would have had a bigger shed. I could have brought them all in, but I had to feed everything. So I had pails on, and if I wasn't feeding, they would have starved on me. And I only had so much room in that shed to bring that 1 yard and my nukes. So that's all there is to it.
John Spear, you had your hand up again.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot initially there, but I think that when you mentioned about the having to bring them back in, then the nice problem for us guys that keep them outside is that they're already prepared for that kind of weather in April, because they've had it all winter, and we've got them sleeved over with the insulation. So we didn't see that kind of attrition so much in April, because they still had the insulation pack on them. But and on this, I don't know whether it's a symptom of Nosema, but I was just noticing on one hive where it had been 5 frame and then dropped down to 4 frame, and I think it kind of held somewhere around 3 frames, and I just left it alone because I just thought, well, I'll just keep an eye on it. And what it looks like to me when I look at this thing, because it still stayed as a 3 frame into June. When I look at the larvae developing, it looks like they're just kind of dry in the bottom of the cell, and they don't seem to have adequate amount of jelly when they're first, when they're first sort of coiling. And I wonder if you noticed that. Is that a symptom of Nosema? Have you seen that anytime in your hives where they just don't seem to be? They just don't seem to be sitting in the right amount of jelly in the bottom of the cell.
Yeah, I believe that's a symptom because nosema is it screws around with the bee's ability to produce the jelly, the hyperophalangeal glands, I think they said it is. They can actively produce the jelly as efficiently. Some of it's malnutrition, but I think there's other things going on. And yeah, they can't feed as effectively, which makes for a malnourished nest. So that's what they tell me, and that's maybe a symptom you're seeing. Could just be that they don't have enough nutrition either.
Thanks. That's good. Thanks.
Oh, that's a harsh connection, John.
I didn't catch that. I'm not sure if that's my line or.
Feel free to type it in if it's if the problem persists.
That's definitely not your side, Ian. John has a
Yeah.
notably low internet link, it seems.
His
Probably
video
would have been good for me to buy wraps to put around my colonies. I was thinking about that too. I just hate wrapping bees so much. I bring them inside so I don't have to wrap hives. But a spring like what we've had, maybe it would have benefited the colonies to have them protected a little bit more. Brad, you have that type of insulation on yours. You probably would have seen a benefit from that through this spring.
Well, maybe I kind of gave up on it, to be honest. It's become just too much of a management pain in the butt. I don't like wrapping hives anymore. You do.
Yeah, but Brad, did you notice a difference between the ones that you did sheathe compared to the ones you didn't get around to?
No, I didn't. That's just it. I didn't really have anything wrapped, we'll call it. There was some with partial wrap just because I hadn't gotten around to taking it off. Maybe this would have been the perfect year to have that all intact, perhaps, but that was kind of an experiment, and I can't say that it didn't have any positive effect, but on, looking at the averages, it's a management pain and an expense that I don't care for. So yeah, I've got nothing of value to add from that perspective.
I know Rob and Marg Smith would have these thick 3 mil poly black sort of coats. They weren't difficult to put on, and when they brought their bees out of the shed, it's the first thing they would throw on, more for the solar gain than the insulation factor, or maybe a bit of a windbreak, and they swore by them. This spring was obscene, so I don't think it would have had a tremendous impact either way, but on their general spring operational practices, they were pretty happy with the results of that. Sometimes it's just a little bit of leverage that helps them get through.
I think there's great value in it, because when I see people who winter outdoors, and they're taking their wraps off the 15th of May, I see their colonies, and they've got double deeps that are absolutely booming, and I'm struggling to get one box filled with bees. I think it's absolutely a benefit. My decision to winter indoors really has everything to do with me and almost nothing to do with the bees. It's a viable solution is really all I was concerned with, and it's a management decision that allows me to manage a couple hundred colonies single-handedly.
Well, and again, I don't think you can detract from, it's all about me, not about the bees, because a person only has limited amounts of resources and energy. You tap out at a certain colony count where you can do it well, beneficial to the bees on your own. And if when you're making decisions on efficiency, you can't fault someone for choosing to winter indoors compared to outdoors. Both methods have advantages, and those advantages are situational. And this spring, maybe outdoors was a bit better than indoors, but
Well, yeah,
it's
I
not,
don't know.
that's not constant. Like Riel's
Yeah.
posted statistics where the indoor-outdoor losses are very, very close.
Almost statistically insignificant. Actually, I think they are statistically insignificant. They're no more than a point or two different, with the advantage indoor. So there certainly is no statistical disadvantage to bringing those indoor colonies outdoors, not wrapped in the spring.
Well, and
But
I think
if you want to look at case by case, and you look at 2022, absolutely, it would be a good idea to bring your bees out of the shed 1st of April and wrap them up for the next 45 days.
well, and there's also like emergency feeding, which would, if you wintered completely outdoors, emergency feeding this spring would have been almost a huge hardship, if not an impossibility. Emergency or doing those really late oxalic acid treatments, even if you're popping them out in November and gassing them and putting them back in. Indoor has these little perks that you can't discount. You can't. But again, it's tomato when it comes to statistics.
If you have a facility that's big enough to put everything on the floor, that is absolutely best case scenario. The times when I could fit about 60 to 80 on the floor in my building, and the years where I've done that, that's beautiful. I can get jars on, middle of March or whatever. If I want, I can get patties in there right away and leave them in the shed. But the fact that they're stacked up, that's just really kiboshes any management right there.
No, absolutely.
Rob, this is hand up.
Rob, do you have a question for Ian or something to say?
I just wanted to provide some observations from the spring related to Ian's comment that he brought from a yard of singles into the shed and his nukes. If you recall, I was wringing my hands because one of my yards, which I winter outdoors, was buried in snow. We're talking, it was behind a windbreak, and there was at least 2 meters of snow on top of it. And they didn't really see the light of day until almost the 1st of May. And I have a couple of other spots where, they're more exposed. They're all wrapped exactly the same. The ones that were under the snow until the 1st of May are absolutely amazing. They're just rocking like crazy. And the other ones, they're less than average. So there's something about, providing some protection when the weather is really crappy. That's all I had to say.
I remember you texting me some pictures of that yard, and you were, pretty distraught because, it's like 3 feet under somewhere in that area over there. And
I remember that too, and I'm so glad you gave us that report, because I was wringing my hands for you.
Well, and even my little 4-frame nuke were fine under all of that insulation, essentially, and they've done they've done just amazingly through the spring, whereas my other ones have not been nearly as productive.
I think it's consistency. I think it's consistency of atmosphere. Those colonies under that big snow blanket, the ground is a major factor in their environment, and the ground is moderating any temperature changes for them buried under that snow blanket. That's my theory. whatever the temperature is, whatever the atmospheric temperature is around that colony, around that hive box. If it's stable, if it's consistent, I think that's a huge key.
Laura in chats mentioned our beloved polystyrene boxes, the Northern European miracle. I've run a couple. I know Laura has some. I know you've run a few, Brad. It's that ultra compressed bee box. I am not compatible with anything else system that has, that has the advantage of really that doesn't require wrapping or very much wrapping. I've run them. The only thing is that in the spring they kind of shine because they do offer that extra little R value. If you are wintering indoors and then you put them outdoors, it's almost like they have a built-in wrap to them. But again, it's not going to save you. It'll give you a little bit of leverage, but I don't think it'll make or break you whether you're using them or not. And the disadvantages of those are significant enough that you have to make amends somewhere else in your operation to accommodate them. Laura?
Yeah, I've never really noticed a difference in spring that made it worth the pain of those boxes. The only reason I use them is because they were free. So I'll use them till they die and then I'll replace them with wooden ones. But he gave me enough of them that it's worth using them till they die. But I haven't noticed much of a difference. I wouldn't go out and buy them. You can't use your hive tool against the edge. They break if you're too rough on them. They're just not fun.
They are a significant pain in the butt for sure.
Yep. I don't like them. And but I didn't really notice a huge difference between those ones and the ones in wood. Even this spring, I didn't notice a dramatic difference between those two.
It's a classic case of what happens when you try to reinvent the wheel. I have never, there's always going to be a different type of hive or a different material, and it's Langstroth and Langstroth compatible till the day you die, because it just everything else ends up just polluting your operation with odds and sods, and then storage is an issue, compatibility is an issue. Suddenly you're trying to put on skateboards, or you're trying to drive bees off of full honey supers, and there's some insignificant crack that you didn't see, and it's
Try to stick an oxalic acid vaporizer tube through the back of a polystyrene hive to treat your bees. See how that goes. It turns into caramel pretty fast.
Yeah, I bet. Can we solicit any questions from the group? Did anything Ian say spark any questions, or anything you want to share about your spring? Feel free to raise your hand and step on up.
Ian, I got a little question for you concerning mating, queen mating time. Now, throwing 2022 out the window, because it is definitely a complete anomaly, and I'm going to ask you to give me an answer in calendar days, which is an unfair question anyway. But considering that we're looking at after graft, 18 days or so, 18 to 20 days before mating flights are happening. When are your mating flights happening for your grafting season, your queen production season? And a follow-up to that would be, do you see any difference in mating success numbers and possibly queen quality?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This topic always creeps up amongst commercial beekeepers, asking, you have that segment of beekeepers that like to push the envelope, and you're always seeing them on Facebook grafting early in the season. And then you see the beekeepers that are always waiting until later in June to be able to achieve the same thing. And both are kind of claiming victory on both. At the conversation, like I think what you're getting at is which way is better? Are you getting better success in the early ones? Because I know beekeepers they will swear by mating with those early drones because they feel that they're most vigorous. Or you're sacrificing the quality by trying to push the envelope a little bit to that. That is a really good question. It's and I don't think I can, I'm sorry, but I don't think I can actually answer that because every year is so variable. I think a lot of it has to do with the bloody wind I have around here in the farm. In some springs it's windy, in some springs it's not. But typically what I find that May, we have all that inconsistency of weather and the wind and the rain and the variability. In June, everything just seems to even out a little bit more. So we have more consistent calm or more consistent, or what you could say, like a mating days. When you look at the weather, you step out the door, oh, today's going to be a good mating day. Yes, I see more of that consistency in June. And whether or not I equate that to, to be honest, I don't track. I guess we could, but I don't. We're pretty much, we're mating. They're hatching at the end of May, going into June. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't think I can actually answer that. I always, but what I try to do is I try to stack the deck in my favor. So I'm looking at that drone chart and I'm saying, well, once I see those drones, then I'm just using math in my favor. So once I see all those walking drones, then I'm going to be seeing those drones flying in those congregating sites. And the more drones that I'm seeing, the more they're going to be up there and the more of a chance that I'm going to be able to get those successful mating flights. So then I'm also looking at pushing it later on into spring to more favorable, stable weather, just to stack my deck in that favor. So did I do your question any justice, Brad?
Oh, absolutely. And you know, if nothing else, the standard beekeeper answer, well, it depends, or I don't know, or, you know.
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
Because, you know, I'm so new at it. I haven't done much of this, and I have noticed.
But that is that's a question. Sorry to step on you. That's a question. I was at the Brandon area beekeepers a while ago. We were in person actually, so that's quite a while ago, and they were talking about that. Someone was bragging about the early queens, and they were saying, well, and these, like, I'm 23 years, 23 years in the business. I consider myself as a rookie. These are like family generational beekeepers, and they're talking these questions. They're asking, well, is that actually a better queen? And we should do studies on whether or not those early queens are actually, they make it 2 years or 3 years, and just kind of track their performance to see if we're actually benefiting ourselves, or if we're better to push it off into summer to where maybe we're getting a better mating flight and such. So those are questions even generational beekeepers, which you think would have figured it out by now, still don't really know.
Yeah. Well, I guess not unexpectedly, my mating success numbers go skyrocket in July. You know, I get near 100% mating success in July, but I don't think high success really necessarily translates into high quality.
No, I agree with you too.
Because yeah. in a beautiful July with lots of days to fly and days that are easy to fly and all that kind of stuff, anybody can fly and mate in that season. You get something that's trying to mate in May, well, only the strongest and fittest is going to possibly mate in May. So there's arguments on both sides, I think, of that, but maybe not as many drones are going to mate with that queen in May because there aren't as many. Maybe more drones are going to mate with that queen in July because there are more, but more of the weak drones are going to mate with that queen in July. So maybe the quality is poorer. There's all those crazy dynamics, you know, to deal with. So as far as timing on the calendar, when do you normally graft and tell? When do you normally kind of shut that down?
So I typically, like I say, I typically start when I'm seeing drones, but in a typical year, that's typically when my ornamental crab tree comes into bloom. And that's typically when the dandelions start to make their appearance. And, that's typically within that May 5th to May 10th or in that area. That's when I'm typically gearing my builders up, because I'm anticipating that split's going to start happening around May 20th. And if I don't start at that time, then I know I'm going to be seeing swarms. So I kind of push things to be able to meet that schedule. I'm looking at that early May to start the graft to be able to get my split start around that May 20th, just so I can get all work. And then bad years I'll run into probably pushing June 10th or so. I'd consider that a late year to split, but I'm not focusing that so much on the queen and mating. I'm focusing more of that work around the split work itself in the operation. So if my work to split the colonies takes till June 7th or June 10th, then that's just because it's taken that long and not because that's when I'm targeting my queen mating. When I do
the last graft, and trying to get an idea of what your last graft date kind of tends to be. Do you go far into July at all, or do you once honey starts to come, do you just say screw it and shut it down because it's too hard to do?
I drop the axe. I say nope, that's no more, because we're transitioning into the honey production season, and I need Carrie to work on other things in queens. So and she wants to make queens all year round, but I say, nope, I drop the axe. Yeah. But I also find, and that's a really good conversation, Brad, because I find the earlier in the spring, going into the early part of June, there's not a lot of predators out there for those queens, right? I have the wind problem, but I don't have dragonflies up there picking off my queens all the time. I found when I tried to make queens all the way through the summer in these little mating nukes, because I wanted to use them to reinforce my problem hives later on in the year, before I really started adopting this nuke management program I have, I'd get terrible success going from, into the honey flow throughout into August. And I attributed that to dragonflies, just the swarms of dragonflies. So I said, screw it. I don't even make nukes going into August. Maybe I'll push nukes end of August into September, some bulk bees. I might try it this year, because I'm going to have to push the boundaries a little bit more. But I just find my success rate just plummets, and I attribute that directly to predators.
Interesting. Interesting.
A question for you, Ian. It's Lloyd Harris.
Oh yes.
Are you looking?
Lloyd, I haven't talked to you for such a long time. It's nice to hear from you.
I did some work a few years ago looking at splitting colonies in the fall, and by about the second to third week of August, you can split all your colonies into 2 colonies and take into winter, either using queen cells or mated queens, preferably mated queens, because the entire winter colony isn't produced until September and October. So you've got a huge population of bees that you're feeding into retirement. This year, when you're looking at putting more colonies into winter, are you thinking about splitting colonies in August at the end of the honey flow?
Yeah, and I'm definitely going to be thinking about that, because I remember our conversations on that, and it kind of shows on that diagram that I showed earlier in the presentation. You have all these unemployed bees, right? I think you called them unemployed bees, and you were putting them back to work, right?
Yeah.
I think I might have to order some queens. I'm not sure if I'm convinced enough to use cells, because I'm afraid that, put all this time and effort into not having a good success because of problems with mating. But if I could get some mated queens, I might be doing that.
I think
sorry, Lloyd, just to interject, I just wanted to touch base on a question we have in chat that's revolving around the discussion that you're having right now on how are late season splits done. Are these done after the honey flow? And if so, how do these late season splits survive the winter? So could I ask, because I know, Lloyd, you've done quite a bit of work on this, can I ask either you or Ian to touch base on, if you are doing late splits, can you do a quick run through? Because I really think that because of the losses, there are people, like as Ian touched base on, are going to be looking at alternative, how do I get my numbers up to get into winter techniques to replenish some of the losses that they have. So if either one of you two gentlemen could kind of go through when you would do a late season split and then how you would go about that.
I've done them as late as the last week of August. And it doesn't really seem to matter how you split them. Like I've split them approximately in half. I've split them with one frame of brood and a bunch of adult bees. I've split them with hardly any brood, and they do reasonably well, as long as you're only cutting the colony in half. If you try and make more than 2 pieces out of the colony, you have problems. But it doesn't seem to matter how you split the colony, as long as you provide them with a reasonable queen. Because you need to produce the bees in September and October. So putting on pollen supplements to get the bees to rear bees in late September and October is what the objective is.
Ian, would you like to step in? Is there any alternative methods or anything you've done in that situation?
Yeah, I think if I'm going to be doing that, I definitely would be ordering some queens in, probably from Kona. Kona is a good place to buy queens in, or Oliveira's. But I'm probably, I'm going to have these empty nukes, and we have all these surplus. Hopefully, I have surplus bees throughout the honey pool. I'll be putting some efforts into that. Is a pretty good strategy. Adds another layer of work onto the honey pool, but I mean, we got to do what we got to do, right?
No, like understandable. And again, this is going to be something that's outside of a lot of people's or a lot of beekeepers' comfort levels, because late season splits are not a novice friendly thing. You are risking weakening strong hives, and wintering nukes isn't something that's considered a novice activity either. One of the conversations that Brad and I had earlier, because of the dearth of packaged bees, is starting the common practice of starting to winter as many nukes as possible, just to help supplement those winter losses as well. And the thought and theory behind that being, if packages are not available to replace those numbers, wintering nukes might become less of a, well, let's see what happens, and more of a, this is what I need to ensure my, my quantity, my quantitative numbers come spring. Is that a realistic approach?
I think the problem for a lot of beekeepers is they don't understand worker average survivability. Like during the summertime, the average bee only lives 35 days. And that average life expectancy doesn't change until about the 2nd or 3rd week of October. So all the bees that are there when you make the split, they'll be dead before winter. It's just, if you do the math, it doesn't take a whole lot to figure out that the bees that are there in August are not going to be there come winter. So those are throwaway bees, and if you can make a colony out of them, you probably should.
Good point. Lynn McGuire, I'm butchering a pronunciation of your last name. Put that question up in chat. Lynn, was there any other follow-ups, or did that, touching on that topic, answer your query? You may have to unmute your mic. Nope, that was great. Thanks. Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate it.
What's since we have Lloyd on here, Lloyd, I just want to really thank Lloyd, because I use the principles that you were just talking about it in my operation many times each year, of course, as winter approaches more and more. Specifically, when the queen is laying those winter bee eggs, when does she start doing that? When does she ramp that up? How long do those summer bees live? All of those principles, and I mean, just to know those, to me, really helps make my plans for my winter clusters, and knowing what's going to affect that winter cluster. And exactly what you just said, that all of those summer bees, that's not your winter cluster. Your winter cluster starts emerging after the 1st of September, if I recall your data correctly.
Yes, and although the population starts about the 1st of September, the later bees actually form a larger percentage of the cluster, because every 12 days, if you look at your colony as a section of repeating 12-day clusters of bees, the first ones in September, most of those have died before winter shows up, mostly because of that 3rd week of October inflection in the survivorship. Up until that time, all the bees have an average life expectancy of 35 days. So you're already 35 days past that come October. So half of those bees that emerged in early September have already died. And the more brood you have later on in the season, the bigger the winter colony. Plus, indoor wintering, colonies will rear brood all winter long. And they rear enough brood during the winter time to almost replace the bees that die during the winter. So they come out of the winter, or should come out of the winter, about the same size as they went in. But when you come out in the spring, that long-lived bee all of a sudden has an average life expectancy of 35 days. So it starts dying at a much faster rate as soon as it starts flying.
There was suggestion, some data that I saw from, well, I won't go into exactly citations, but they were talked about flight in the fall. It's kind of like, I liken it to shopping for a car. It's not the age, it's the mileage. And what they talked about was, if there's an unusually high amount of flight in, say, October, those clusters won't make it till spring, because the winter bees have too many miles on them by now, before winter. Does that fit in with your data?
I don't think so. I don't think it's the miles on the bees. I think it's a temperature effect that's happening, that if you have daytime temperatures, preferably less than 10 degrees, maybe less than 5 degrees, it induces a long-lived, and I think it is a function of juvenile hormone production in bees. If the bees produce juvenile hormone, these things become foragers or fly. And if they don't produce it, they stay home. And temperature at that time of the year reduces the level of juvenile hormone being produced by bees. So all of a sudden they go from 35 days to 50 to 100 days on average.
So the flight that they were citing was a symptom rather than being
It's an opinion.
Well,
just like some of the stuff that I give you is an opinion.
But you know, that would fit, because when the temperatures are too high in a month that should be cold, like October, cooler, then certain things happen, and the things that we can see are flight. You know, the things that we maybe don't see as easily as the amount of juvenile hormone. So, you know, it could be that the flight is a symptom rather than the cause of the problem. And I'm just, you know, this winter we had a very, very abnormal October last fall, and then we're follow that up with one of the worst winters that anybody has ever talked about for bee mortality. And I can't help but think that those two things are directly related.
Well, and the genetic component of the queens that made it through this year, the colonies that made it through this year, the attributes of being able to have more winter bees to outlast the cold chill. You know, I can see breeding for ugly springs being a genetic attribute that's favorable for breeders. Like, and that
Tim just put a question in chat that's been on my mind just now too, is should we be encouraging more brood in September rather than shutting down late fall brood?
Well, isn't that a bit of a double-edged sword, right? Like, I mean, if you get the fall bees that winter bees that you're looking for compared to the amount of resources, I think you could have some control over that with your feeding program, but maybe, yeah. Like, what do you guys think?
There's not much brood in my hives early to mid-October.
Well, the one thing you will find with colonies in the winter or in the fall is the older the queen, the sooner it shuts off brood rearing.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have old queens in your colonies, you're not going to have the same level of brood production in fall or during winter. It'll still take place, but it will be at a lower level. And then you start looking at the math in terms of they're dying at the same rate. They're being added to the population at a slower rate. You've got smaller colonies.
But there's a certain counter position here where, let's say you're trying to stimulate egg laying by introducing pollen patties or a pollen source, and then you have to factor in the mite component, because the longer that queen is raising brood, the mites have a stronger toehold into having a higher population going through in the winter. So there's this trifecta balance environment you're creating here, where, you know, fall brood is good but creates mites, which is bad, which, you know, and how it's finding that unique balance for your operation that seems to be the key here.
Like, that's the axiom of life. You never get something for nothing.
There's always a trade-off.
There's always a trade-off. And yes, you have to look after your mites. And I probably treat for mites later than anybody else that is prepared to discuss it. But I do put my mite treatments in late, usually at the beginning of September, to try and get rid of the mites so that I don't have the problem during winter.
Rob, you had a question for the, it's almost starting to feel like a panel.
Yeah, so I wanted to sort of bring a couple of issues together. Lloyd was talking about the sort of the late summer split and sort of encouraging brood rearing later in the fall, and the potential issues with mites. I'm reminded of Randy Oliver's spreadsheet for Varroa, where he sort of predicts with the spreadsheet when your colonies are going to collapse and that sort of thing. But one of the things that he suggests as a mite strategy is the split. So I just wanted the opinion of Lloyd and Ian about what the potential effect of that late summer split would have on your mites. My guess is that it would cut the population in half, and that would make any subsequent treatments in the fall that much more effective, and perhaps that would contribute to a very low mite population going into the winter. So I just wanted Lloyd and Ian to give have an opportunity to comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll let Lloyd jump in on that. Lloyd is my mentor, whether he knows it or not. So I'll just stand in the wake of Lloyd to respond to that question.
Well, when you split colonies, you're usually not making them broodless. You could make them broodless, but that's not normally the case. So as long as you've got larvae there that are developing, you will have mites that will eventually find their way to feed on the pupae. So I'm not sure how much effect splitting the colony is going to have on mite populations, other than if you are not also treating with an insecticide or miticide at the same time you're doing these other things, you're going to have a problem. Like if you split the colonies, you're not getting away from treating for mites. You still have to treat for mites.
No, I think I didn't explain it well enough. So if I have a colony and let's say there's 1,000 mites in the colony, if I split it, now I have 2 colonies with only 500. There's still going to be, I've split the brood and everything, so I'm going to have those mites spread between, instead of 1 colony, and now I have them in 2 colonies. And so when I apply my fall miticide, I'm applying them to a population with a lower number. And what my question is am I going to end up with 2 colonies with that potentially are at a lower threshold of mites than if I'd not split them?
I don't think it's going to make a difference. I don't think it's going to have an impact on your mite population. And the way you're calculating things is on a percentage basis. So you've cut the population in half, you've cut the brood in half, you've cut the mite population in half, the percentages are still the same.
If I can jump in here, I would agree with Lloyd that it likely won't make any difference. If anything, though, I think it might make a negative difference, because now you have 2 queens, more brood, and more brood equals more mites. So that's just my take.
But you're going to have to treat for mites, and instead of, if you're overwintering a colony in a 2 brood chamber system, now you have 4 strips of mite treatment in 1 colony. If you split them in half, you have 2 in 2 colonies. So you have twice as many colonies, and you've cut your cost for that individual colony in half. Make sense or not?
Yeah, I think I'm following you on that logic too. Splitting the bees, splitting the mites, splitting the space. So it's basically the same thing, just between 2 separate boxes. The bottom line is you need that mite treatment to work in either case. Otherwise, the mites are going to rule the day anyways, I guess.
The mite infestation, in effect, what it does is change worker bee longevity, and it changes it very significantly. There aren't a lot of data available on worker longevity and mites, other than to say that average life expectancy can be under 20 days. So if you've got 20-day life expectancy instead of 35, you have to produce almost twice as many larvae to keep the colony at the same size. It's a mathematical game. Those spreadsheets that I share shows all the data from my graduate thesis, and if you want to see the effect of requeening a colony at a particular time, you just drop in the other data set and it'll regraph it for you. So you have some idea of what the colony would look like with mated queens, queen cells, colony reared supersedure cells. And then if you want to play with the data some more, you can just change those values on the fly and see what's going to happen to your colony. If you look at that same data set and take out the brood production during the winter time, those colonies get small in a hurry.
Okay, so I'm going to try one more time. So if I follow in what you were saying earlier, the bees that I have in August, they're going to die anyways. What I'm going to have are the bees that are produced in late September and October. If I don't split them, I'm probably going to, what I'm taking from your comments is that my winter nest is going to be determined by how many, what that queen can produce late in September and into October.
Yes.
So if I don't split them, I have all those mites in that one colony. And if I apply a miticide and it's 90% effective, I'm going to have 90% of all those mites killed, but I'm going to have 10% of the larger population infesting that nest. If I split it, then I'm going to be able to have I'm going to be starting at a lower number. I'm going to have the same size population because I've got 2 queens producing that winter nest now. And because I started at a lower number, in each hive, I'm going to have fewer mites than I would have if I hadn't split them. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Probably the same number of mites collectively. Like, don't think about the numbers of creatures, but the percentage of creatures. And the percentages you haven't changed at all.
But if I have fewer mites, if the splits end up with the same population as an unsplit colony, then I do have fewer mites.
But they're spread over 2 colonies.
Isn't that better?
Yes, that is. That's what I'm saying is that
Okay.
You're further off to take your colonies after the honey flow or when the honey flow is almost over and make 2 colonies out of them and introduce a mated queen probably to both of them, because you're going to have an individual that is going to produce brood longer than if you had 2 old queens.
Mm.
The old queens drop off brood production, and this data is from package colonies. So those new queens were spring queens. They quit brood production by about, I'd have to look at the data set, but I think it's mid-September, it's already almost 0. Where when you put in a mated queen or a queen cell, that population is shifted into the fall a little further. Does that make sense?
I love the idea of this fall split because it's gonna it seems like it's going to be a real boost to us this year, especially. But I do think it also it would be worth looking at the spreadsheets that you and Randy have produced to see if the modeling suggests that you would end up with more effective mite treatment, which might alleviate some of the concerns that John Russell was talking about. Anyways, I'll just leave it at that.
Well, if you send me a request, I will send you the results of a study I did for the Saskatchewan Beekeepers Association, looking at splitting colonies in late August. And the material was submitted to bee culture, but they seem to think that the paper was too long, and I haven't had the time to try and make it shorter. They said it would probably make 2 papers, but I would taking a long paper and making it into 2 papers is like writing 2 new papers from scratch.
Lloyd, if you would like to maybe type your email, if you're brave enough, in chat, and then people could solicit that study from you directly, and you could disseminate it that way, if that's okay with you.
I think you've got a copy of my email address.
I'll type it in chat, if with your permission, though.
Sure.
That's okay?
Yes.
Okay.
And I can share that material, I think, with people. Essentially, I would probably split colonies a little sooner than I did for this study, but they were split at that time of year because I was using the colonies in another study, and I couldn't start this study until I finished the other one.
Understood.
So in this part of the world, typically you would be able to split colonies about the end of the first week of August, because the honey flow is over in a lot of places.
Lloyd, there's a question in chat that was asking if you're doing late season apivar applications, what you would suggest for a spring treatment if required, or did you generally not worry about it at that point?
If I was doing a spring treatment, I would use one of the other insecticides or miticides. Okay. I wouldn't use the same material twice back to back.
No, that's good practice. It is 10 after 10, and I'm sure some of you want to actually call it a night, and we are pushing Ian's generosity for taking the time out of his evening. That being said, did anyone have any other questions for Ian from his presentation? Or Ian, is there anything you'd like to add before we can kind of go to the after party? where the diehards hang out till midnight, but I just want to be sensitive to other people's schedules, that's all.
Yeah, we'll just say we'll cut the questions off for me. I gotta hit the hay here, but I want to say before I log off, is I come to these groups and I listen to presentations, not necessarily so much like listening to like I'm presenting here. I don't come to listen to the conversation from guys that think like Rob and Lloyd there, because you can glean their thoughts and kind of understand what's going on in their minds and kind of help understand how we see bees. And so that's where this all works is you bring a sideshow like me in, or sideshow like somebody else in, to attract a group. And then if you can somehow get guys like those two to talk, then it just brings a whole bunch of gold out, and every once in a while you tap into that. So I appreciate the conversation around all that, guys, and has made my evening very worthwhile. So thank you for that. But I'm going to have to log off because I got a 5 o'clock start again tomorrow morning. So I'll be hopefully doing some beekeeping in some sunny weather.
No problem at all. And Ian, I really appreciate you taking the time. I would like to debate the whole self-appointed rookie status because, yeah, I don't know. Humble as you are, there you go. There's the equivalent of like beekeepers being like doctors, where the fresh young ones who have all the recent research and education, but not necessarily the experience. And then there's this bell curve where the older doctors stop, keeping up with the new findings and the research. But you know what? You're in your prime, buddy. So don't cut yourself short.
Well, all I know is when guys like Lloyd talk, I listen. So that's
Oh, we all should. We all should. Yeah. Thanks again, Ian. We'll let you go. And again, anyone else who signed in today to listen to Ian and the discussions, we really appreciate it. We are going to actually bring this presentation to a close, so Brad doesn't have to spend 10 hours editing it this time.
That's no problem, buddy.
but we are going to keep the meeting open. If anyone wants to hang out and talk with bees, there's usually a little bit of nuggets still to come. So thanks again, Ian, and I hope you have a great night.
Have a good night. Thanks, guys.
Okay,
Thanks for fitting us in, boss.